The text came at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night while I was celebrating with my family at my little sister's quinceañera. Emma, effective immediately. Your employment with Pinnacle Dynamics has been terminated. Security will collect your badge Monday morning. Do not enter the building. That was it. After I had just saved the entire company from bankruptcy and secured $800 million in funding, my boss, Michael Thompson, fired me through a text message like I was some intern who'd messed up the coffee order. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Michael didn't know was that I had discovered something that would destroy not just his career, but his entire life. Because while he was firing me for supposedly failing to meet performance standards, $800 million was quietly disappearing from the company accounts into shell companies that he controlled. The same $800 million that I had spent 6 months of my life fighting to secure while he was planning the biggest corporate theft in Texas history. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 29 years old, and until that text message, I was the Senior Financial Analyst at Pinnacle Dynamics, a software company here in Austin that creates automation solutions for manufacturing plants. I grew up in East Austin, where my parents worked double shifts at the packing plant just to keep food on the table. I was the first person in my family to graduate college, and definitely the first to get an MBA. Everything I had worked for, everything my family had sacrificed for, was supposed to culminate in the corner office I'd been promised after saving the company. Instead, I got a text message while my abuela was teaching me how to fold tamales for Christmas. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really began, because understanding how we got here is crucial to understanding just how evil Michael Thompson really was. 8 months ago, Pinnacle Dynamics was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured water balloon. Our flagship AI automation product had completely flopped in the market, burning through $40 million in development costs for something that barely worked half the time. Our biggest client, Automotive Alliance, had just canceled a $200 million contract because our software kept shutting down their entire assembly line. The company was facing bankruptcy within 60 days. 400 employees were about to lose their jobs right before the holidays. The Austin tech community was buzzing with rumors that Pinnacle was finished, that Michael Thompson had finally bitten off more than he could chew with his ambitious expansion plans and flashy marketing campaigns. That's where I came in. While everyone else was updating their LinkedIn profiles and polishing their resumes, I was pulling 18-hour days in the finance department, going through every single expense, every contract, every vendor agreement with a magnifying glass. I wasn't just trying to save my job, I was trying to save everyone's job. See, my parents taught me that when things get tough, you don't run away. You roll up your sleeves and you fight. And fight I did. I identified $85 million in annual cost savings by renegotiating vendor contracts, consolidating duplicate software licenses, and restructuring our office leases. I found departments that were doing the same work twice and merged them. I discovered subscription services we'd been paying for that nobody was even using. Most importantly, I created a comprehensive 18-month turnaround plan that showed exactly how Pinnacle could not only survive, but thrive. But here's the thing about being broke as a company: you need cash immediately to implement any long-term plan. So while I was cutting costs, I was also courting investors. Not just any investors, but the kind of serious institutional money that could provide the bridge financing we needed to execute the turnaround. I spent 3 months flying to Dallas, Houston, and California, presenting to venture capital firms and private equity groups. I learned to speak their language, to frame our crisis not as a failure, but as an opportunity. A proven company with strong fundamentals that had hit a temporary setback and was now perfectly positioned for explosive growth under new leadership and direction. Most of them laughed me out of the room. A 29-year-old Latina from East Austin trying to save a sinking ship? But I kept going back. I refined my presentation, addressed every concern, provided more data, more projections, more proof that Pinnacle Dynamics was worth saving. Finally, Meridian Capital Partners agreed to lead a Series D funding round, $800 million, the largest funding round in Austin tech history. Not only would it save the company, but it would position us to become the dominant player in manufacturing automation software. I still remember the day the term sheet came through. I was sitting in my tiny cubicle because despite being the person single-handedly saving the company, I was still crammed into the general finance bullpen while Michael Thompson had his corner office with the view of Lady Bird Lake. My phone buzzed with an email from Meridian's managing partner. Terms accepted. Looking forward to partnership. Wire instructions to follow. I actually cried. Right there at my desk, I broke down crying because I had done it. Not only had I saved 400 jobs, but I had secured enough funding to make Pinnacle into something truly special. Something that would put Austin on the map as a serious tech hub. Something my parents could brag about to their friends at church. Michael Thompson's reaction was everything I should have expected, but somehow still surprised me. When I knocked on his office door to share the news, he barely looked up from his computer. "Great work, Emma," he said in the same tone you'd use to acknowledge someone had restocked the coffee supplies. "I'll take it from here." Take it from here. Like I was some junior analyst who had done the preliminary legwork, and now the real professionals would handle the important parts. But I was so relieved that the company was saved, so excited about what this meant for everyone's job security, that I didn't push back. I should have. God, I should have pushed back right then and there. The funding was supposed to close in 30 days. During those 30 days, Michael Thompson transformed from a stressed CEO fighting for his company's survival into a man who acted like he'd already won the lottery. New suits every day, each one probably costing more than my monthly rent. He started talking about expansion plans, new offices, acquisitions. He hired a photographer to take new headshots for the company website and spent 3 hours getting the lighting just right. Meanwhile, I was working around the clock to finalize all the due diligence requirements the investors needed. Financial statements, legal documents, operational reports, compliance certifications. Everything had to be perfect because $800 million doesn't just show up without serious scrutiny. And Michael was loving every minute of the attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Austin Business Journal wanted to do a cover story on the comeback CEO who saved his company from bankruptcy. Texas Monthly was planning a feature on innovative leadership and crisis management. The local news wanted him for their business segment about entrepreneurship in Austin. In every single interview, every article, every press appearance, Michael Thompson told the same story about how his visionary leadership and strategic thinking had identified the cost-saving opportunities and attracted the investment capital. That saved Pinnacle Dynamics. My name was never mentioned. My work was never acknowledged. According to the official narrative, I was just another employee who had helped implement the brilliant plans developed by CEO Michael Thompson. I told myself it didn't matter. Let him have the credit as long as everyone kept their jobs, as long as the company survived, as long as my career trajectory stayed pointed upward, because surely when the dust settled, people would know who had really done the work. The funding officially closed on a Friday afternoon in October. $800 million transferred into Pinnacle's operating accounts. The largest single cash infusion in company history. Enough money to fund operations. For years, while we developed new products, expanded into new markets, and hired the best talent in the industry. That night, Michael threw a party at his house in Westlake Hills. The whole company was invited to celebrate our survival and future success. I remember standing on his back deck, looking out over the lake, thinking about how different my life was going to be now. How I'd proven that a girl from East Austin could play in the big leagues and win. Michael gave a speech thanking everyone for their hard work during the difficult times. He talked about teamwork and resilience and the bright future ahead of us. Then he raised his glass of champagne and said, "Here's to the team that saved. Pinnacle Dynamics." Everyone cheered. Everyone felt included. Everyone felt valued. I should have known something was wrong when he pulled me aside afterward and said, "Emma, you've been working so hard these past few months. Why don't you take a long weekend? Get some rest. You've earned it." At the time, I thought he was being considerate. Looking back, I realized he was getting me out of the office so I wouldn't see what was happening to the money. That long weekend was when I went to my sister's quinceañera. 3 days of family, food, and celebration. 3 days of feeling proud of what I'd accomplished and excited about what came next. 3 days of believing that hard work and dedication would be rewarded. And then came the text message. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe his phone had been hacked. Maybe someone was playing a cruel prank. There was no way the CEO of a company would fire someone by text message, especially not the person who had just saved his entire business. But when I tried to call him, it went straight to voicemail. When I tried to email him, I got an auto reply saying he was traveling on business and would respond when possible. When I called the main office number, the night security guard told me that my access badge had already been deactivated. It was real. After saving the company from bankruptcy, after securing $800 million in funding, after working 18-hour days for 6 months, I had been fired by text message without warning, without explanation, without even a conversation. I spent that entire Sunday night staring at my phone, refreshing my email, waiting for some kind of clarification or explanation. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe he meant someone else. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up first thing Monday morning. Monday morning came and went without any clarification. Instead, there was an email from HR informing me that a security guard would meet me at the building entrance to collect my badge and any company property. I would not be allowed inside. My personal items from my desk would be mailed to me within 5 business days. I drove to the office anyway, hoping to find some answers. The security guard was waiting for me in the lobby, a guy named Frank who I'd chatted with countless times during my late-night work sessions. He looked embarrassed as he asked for my badge and laptop bag. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said quietly. "I don't understand any of this either." As I handed over my badge, the elevator doors opened and several of my former colleagues stepped out. They all looked shocked to see me there, but when I tried to approach them, Frank gently but firmly guided me toward the exit. "Company policy," he said. "I'm really sorry." Walking back to my car, I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. None of this made sense. You don't fire the person who just saved your company. You don't fire someone by text message. You don't treat people like criminals when they've done nothing wrong. But the worst part was yet to come. That afternoon, I got a call from Jake Martinez, one of the database administrators who I'd worked closely with during the cost-cutting analysis. Jake was the kind of guy who noticed everything, especially when it came to financial data and system, access logs. "Emma," he said, his voice tight with stress, "I need to tell you something, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at Grind Coffee on 6th Street in an hour?" The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench. Whatever Jake needed to tell me wasn't going to be good news. An hour later, I was sitting across from Jake at a small table in the back corner of the coffee shop, watching him nervously scan the room like he expected someone to be listening to our conversation. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," he began, "but something really weird is happening with the company. Accounts." My heart started racing. What kind of weird? Jake pulled out his laptop and angled the screen so only I could see it. "I've been monitoring the system traffic since the funding closed, just routine maintenance stuff. But look at this." What I saw on his screen made my blood run cold. The funding hadn't just been deposited into Pinnacle's main operating account. It had been immediately transferred out again, split between dozens of different accounts that I didn't recognize. "These account numbers," I said, pointing at the screen, "they're not in our normal vendor payment system. That's what I thought too, Jake said. So I did some digging. Emma, these aren't vendor accounts. They're shell companies. Dozens of them. All registered in the last 6 months. All with the same registered agent in Delaware. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. How much money are we talking about? Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up transfer records and account balances. As of this morning, $647 million has been moved out of the main account into these shell companies. The remaining money is being transferred in smaller amounts, probably to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection. Systems. $647 million. More than 3/4 of the funding I had spent 6 months fighting to secure. Money that was supposed to save 400 jobs and transform Pinnacle into an industry leader. Money that was now sitting in accounts controlled by companies that didn't seem to actually exist. Jake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, who has access to authorized transfers of this size? He didn't need to answer. We both knew that only one person at Pinnacle Dynamics had the authority to move that kind of money without board approval or additional authorization. Michael Thompson was stealing the funding I had secured to save his company, and he had fired me to make sure I wouldn't be around to notice. The next few days were the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything, except the horrifying reality that Michael Thompson was systematically stealing the money I had fought so hard to secure. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those account numbers on Jake's screen, millions of dollars flowing out of Pinnacle's accounts like water through a broken dam. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe these were legitimate business expenses I didn't understand. Maybe Michael was moving money into investment accounts or setting up subsidiary companies for expansion. Maybe there was some sophisticated financial strategy at play that was beyond my comprehension as a senior analyst. But deep down, I knew better. I had spent months immersed in every detail of Pinnacle's financial structure. I knew every vendor, every subsidiary, every legitimate business relationship. Those shell companies weren't part of any business strategy. They were theft, plain and simple. The worst part was feeling completely powerless to do anything about it. Who was I going to call? The police? And tell them what exactly? That my former boss had fired me and now I suspected him of stealing money based on account numbers I'd seen on a laptop screen? I was a terminated employee with no access to official company records, no standing to make accusations, and no proof beyond Jake's informal monitoring of system traffic. I tried reaching out to other former colleagues, hoping someone else had noticed something suspicious. Most of them were too scared to even talk to me. Word had apparently gotten around that I'd been terminated for performance issues, and nobody wanted to be seen associating with someone who'd fallen out of favor with management. But not everyone was scared. Lisa Chen had been Michael's executive assistant for 3 years, and she was one of the few people at Pinnacle who had always been genuinely kind to me. While other executives treated support staff like furniture, I made it a point to learn their names, ask about their families, and treat them with respect. Lisa remembered that. She called me on Thursday afternoon, almost a week after my termination. "Emma, can you meet me for lunch today? Somewhere not near the office?" We met at a small Vietnamese restaurant in South Austin, the kind of place where you order at the counter and find your own table. Lisa looked nervous, constantly checking her phone and glancing toward the door like she expected someone to walk in and catch us together. "I've been Michael's assistant for 3 years," she began without preamble. "I've seen him lie to investors, manipulate board members, and take credit for other people's work. But what he's doing now is different. This isn't just corporate politics. This is criminal." She pulled a folder from her purse and slid it across the table. "I've been keeping copies of everything: emails, meeting notes, phone logs, calendar, entries." I told myself it was just good record keeping, but honestly, I think I knew something like this was coming. I opened the folder and immediately understood why Lisa looked so nervous. The first document was an email from Michael to someone named Robert Kellner, at a company called Meridian Holdings. Not Meridian Capital Partners, the investment firm that had provided our funding, but Meridian Holdings, which appeared to be one of the shell companies Jake had identified. The email was dated just 2 days after our funding had closed. Phase 1 complete. $800 million confirmed in primary account. Beginning distribution according to our discussion. Expect first transfer within 48 hours. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't some impulsive crime of opportunity. Michael had been planning this theft from the very beginning, possibly even before I'd started negotiating with the real Meridian Capital Partners. "There's more," Lisa said quietly. "Look at the calendar entries." She had printed out Michael's calendar for the past 6 months, and the pattern was impossible to miss. While I was flying around the country meeting with legitimate investors, Michael was having regular meetings with Robert Kellner and others from the shell companies. Sometimes these meetings were listed under fake names or coded references, but Lisa had kept track of who was actually coming to the office. "This meeting here," she said, pointing to an entry from 3 months ago, was listed as Strategic Planning Session with Operations Team. But I know it was actually Michael, Robert Kellner, and 2 other men I'd never seen before. They were in his office for 4 hours with the door locked. No operations team members were involved. I flipped through more pages, and the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just Michael acting alone. He had an entire network of accomplices helping him structure the theft, create the shell companies, and move the money through multiple accounts to obscure the trail. "Lisa, why are you showing me this? You could lose your job." She laughed bitterly. "Emma, I'm going to lose my job anyway. You think Michael is going to keep paying salaries when he's stolen all the company's money? I heard him on a phone call yesterday talking about filing for bankruptcy within the next month. He's going to claim that the funding fell through, that the investors changed their minds, that market conditions made the deal impossible." That hit me like a physical blow. Michael wasn't just stealing the money. He was planning to destroy the company entirely, probably to cover his tracks and make the theft look like a business failure rather than a criminal act. 400 people were going to lose their jobs not because the company couldn't be saved, but because the person who was supposed to save it had decided to rob it instead. "There's something else," Lisa continued. "Yesterday, Michael had me book him a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands for next month. Business class. He said it was for a long-term business development opportunity. But Emma, we don't have any business in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands, where financial criminals go to disappear with their stolen money. Michael wasn't just planning to steal the funding, he was planning to flee the country and leave everyone else to deal with the aftermath." I felt that familiar rage building in my chest, the same anger that had driven me to work 18-hour days to save Pinnacle in the first place. But this time, it wasn't about saving the company. This time, it was about making sure Michael Thompson faced the consequences of what he'd done. "Lisa, I need you to do something for me. Can you keep tracking his communications and meetings? I think I know someone who might be able to help us, but I'm going to need more evidence." She nodded immediately. "Anything. This man has to be stopped." That evening, I called Patricia Williams, who had been on Pinnacle's board of directors until she resigned 6 months ago in what was described as a disagreement over strategic direction. Patricia was a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into corporate governance consulting, and she was known throughout Austin as someone who didn't tolerate corruption or misconduct. I'd met Patricia several times during board presentations, and she had always struck me as someone who valued competence and integrity over politics and networking. If anyone would listen to my story and take it seriously, it would be her. "Emma," she said when she answered my call, "I heard about your termination. I have to say I was surprised. Your financial analysis was some of the best work I'd seen in 20 years of corporate governance." That simple acknowledgement meant more to me than she could know. For the first time since my termination, someone with real authority was recognizing the value of what I had accomplished. Patricia, I need to tell you something about what's happening at Pinnacle, but it's complicated, and I'm not sure you'll believe me. Try me. I spent the next hour walking her through everything Jake had discovered about the account transfers, everything Lisa had documented about Michael's secret meetings, and everything I suspected about his plans to flee the country. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific details. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Emma," she finally said, "what you're describing is securities fraud on a massive scale. If Michael Thompson has actually stolen investor funds the way you've outlined, he's looking at decades in federal prison." "But how do we prove it? I'm a terminated employee with no access to official records. Jake could lose his job for sharing system information. Lisa is risking everything just by talking to me. We need to get this information to the right people, and we need to do it quickly. If Michael is planning to leave the country, we're running out of time." Patricia explained that as a former federal prosecutor, she still had connections at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI's white-collar crime unit. But she emphasized that they would need more than circumstantial evidence and suspicious account transfers to build a criminal case. "We need communications that explicitly discuss the theft. We need documentation of how the shell companies were created and who controls them. We need evidence that shows intent to defraud investors and employees. Most importantly, we need to catch him in the act of moving money or communicating with his accomplices." Over the next 2 weeks, Lisa became our inside source while Jake continued monitoring the financial systems. Every day brought new evidence of the scope of Michael's fraud. Email conversations about offshore banking procedures, meeting notes discussing how to structure transfers to avoid federal reporting requirements, phone logs showing regular communication, with contacts in countries known for banking secrecy. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. David Kim was a retired CFO who had worked at several major corporations before starting his own financial consulting firm. I had met him during my investor outreach efforts, and he had been impressed enough with my presentation to offer informal mentoring as I navigated the funding process. When I called David to tell him about my termination and what I had discovered about the stolen funding, his reaction was not what I expected. "Emma, I need to tell you something. About 2 weeks ago, I got a call from someone claiming to represent Pinnacle Dynamics. They wanted to hire my firm to help structure some international business arrangements. The person I spoke with said they had gotten my name from you." My stomach dropped. "David, I never gave anyone your name for international business arrangements. I know that now. At the time, I thought it was strange because the projects they described didn't match anything you had mentioned about Pinnacle's business model. They were asking about setting up subsidiaries in jurisdictions with banking secrecy laws, structuring transactions to minimize U.S. tax liability, and creating corporate structures that would be difficult for regulators to trace." David had declined the work because it sounded suspicious, but he had kept detailed notes about the conversation, including the name and contact information of the person who had called him, Robert Kellner from Meridian Holdings, the same person Lisa had identified as Michael's primary accomplice. "Here's the thing, Emma. The person who called me made a mistake. He mentioned that their primary account was holding approximately $800 million that needed to be moved through multiple jurisdictions quickly and discreetly. That's not the kind of information you share with a consultant you've never met unless you're desperate. $800 million, the exact amount of Pinnacle's funding round. This was the smoking gun we needed to prove that Michael and his accomplices were actively working to steal and hide the investor money. But even with all this evidence, we still faced a fundamental problem. Michael Thompson was the CEO of a successful company with powerful connections throughout Austin's business community. I was a terminated employee making accusations that would be easy to dismiss as the complaints of a disgruntled worker seeking revenge. We needed to catch him in the act, and we needed to do it in a way that would be impossible for him to deny or explain away. That's when Patricia suggested something that initially seemed impossible, but gradually began to make sense. The annual Texas Innovation Summit was scheduled for the following month at the Austin Convention Center. It was the biggest tech conference in the state, attended by thousands of entrepreneurs, investors, executives, and journalists. Michael Thompson was scheduled to be a keynote speaker, discussing crisis leadership and strategic recovery based on his supposed success in saving Pinnacle Dynamics from bankruptcy. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What if we could arrange for the truth to come out during his presentation? Patricia suggested. In front of the entire Texas tech community, with journalists and photographers documenting everything. It sounded like something out of a movie, but the more we discussed it, the more feasible it became. Lisa had access to Michael's calendar and could monitor his communications leading up to the conference. Jake could track any large money movements that might signal Michael was preparing to flee. David could work his contacts in the financial industry to gather more evidence about the shell companies. And Patricia could coordinate with federal investigators to ensure that when we exposed Michael's crimes, there would be authorities ready to take immediate action. But pulling this off would require perfect timing, careful coordination, and a level of risk that made my palms sweat just thinking about it. If we failed, Michael would know we were onto him, and he would probably accelerate his timeline for leaving the country. If we succeeded, we would be publicly accusing one of Austin's most prominent CEOs of massive fraud in front of an audience of thousands. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error couldn't be smaller. As we planned our strategy, I kept thinking about all the people whose lives hung in the balance. The 400 Pinnacle employees who thought their jobs were secure because of the funding I had arranged. The investors who had trusted Michael with $800 million based on the turnaround plan I had created. The Austin tech community that would be damaged by the scandal if a major CEO turned out to be a criminal. But I also thought about my parents, who had worked double shifts their entire lives without ever having the opportunity to fight back against people who took advantage of them. I thought about my little sister, whose quinceañera celebration had been interrupted by the text message that started this nightmare. I thought about every woman who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated by men like Michael Thompson. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money or saving jobs, though both of those things mattered enormously. This was about proving that you don't get to destroy people's lives without consequences. This was about showing that sometimes the person you think is powerless turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room. Michael Thompson had made the mistake of thinking that firing me would eliminate the threat I posed to his criminal plans. He was about to learn that the opposite was true. The planning phase took 3 weeks of careful coordination and evidence gathering. Every day, Lisa provided updates on Michael's communications and travel plans. Every day, Jake tracked new money transfers and system access logs. Every day, Patricia worked with federal investigators to build a case that would hold up in court. And every day, I felt the weight of responsibility for everyone whose future depended on our success. By the time the Texas Innovation Summit arrived, we had assembled a comprehensive dossier documenting Michael's fraud, his network of accomplices, the structure of the shell companies, and the movement of the stolen funds. We had communications showing his intent to flee the country. We had financial records proving the theft. We had witness testimony from multiple sources. Most importantly, we had a plan to expose everything in the most public and undeniable way possible. Michael Thompson thought he was going to give a speech about crisis leadership to a room full of admirers. Instead, he was about to face the consequences of betraying everyone who had trusted him. The morning of the conference, I woke up at 5 a.m. with butterflies in my stomach and steel in my spine. Today was the day we would find out whether justice was possible or whether powerful men like Michael Thompson were truly untouchable. I got dressed in my best business suit, the one I had worn to investor meetings when I was fighting to save Pinnacle Dynamics. It seemed appropriate to wear it again on the day I would finish what I had started months ago. Today, Michael Thompson, would learn that Emma Rodriguez from East Austin was not someone you could dismiss with a text message. The Austin Convention Center was buzzing with energy as thousands of tech professionals, investors, and entrepreneurs filed through the main entrance for the Texas Innovation Summit. I stood across the street at a coffee cart, nursing a latte I was too nervous to drink. Watching the stream of people in expensive suits and startup casual wear heading into the building where Michael Thompson would deliver his keynote address in just 4 hours. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Federal agents in position. SEC investigators coordinating with local law enforcement. Everything is ready on our end. How are you holding up? I typed back quickly. Nervous but determined. Lisa confirms Michael arrived 30 minutes ago and is in the green room reviewing his presentation. No idea what's coming. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Michael Thompson was about to give a speech titled Crisis Leadership and Strategic Recovery to an audience that included many of the same investors and business leaders I had pitched to during my efforts to save Pinnacle Dynamics. He was planning to take credit for the very turnaround strategy I had developed, while the money I had secured sat in offshore accounts under his control. But what Michael didn't know was that his presentation slides had been replaced with something very different. Jake had managed to gain remote access to the convention center's audio-visual system through a contact who worked for the tech company handling the event. Instead of Michael's carefully crafted story about visionary leadership, the audience would see documented evidence of his crimes projected on a 60-foot screen in high definition. I made my way into the convention center, using the press credentials Patricia had arranged through a journalist contact. The main auditorium was massive, with seating for 3,000 people and a stage that looked like something from a late-night talk show. Tech conferences loved their dramatic lighting and sleek design elements. The morning sessions were focused on emerging technologies and startup funding trends. I sat through presentations on artificial intelligence, blockchain applications, and sustainable manufacturing, but I couldn't concentrate on any of it. My mind kept racing through all the ways our plan could go wrong. What if Jake couldn't maintain access to the AV system? What if Michael noticed something suspicious and decided not to give his presentation? What if the federal investigators weren't able to move quickly enough to prevent him from destroying evidence or fleeing? What if the audience didn't believe what they were seeing and dismissed it as some kind of hoax or misunderstanding? During the lunch break, I spotted Michael across the exhibition hall, holding court with a group of venture capitalists and tech executives. He looked completely relaxed, confident, even jovial as he shook hands and exchanged business cards. The man who had stolen $800 million and was planning to destroy 400 jobs was networking like he didn't have a care in the world. Watching him laugh at someone's joke while I knew what he had done made my stomach turn. How could someone commit such massive fraud and then act so casually normal? How could he look those investors in the eye, knowing he had stolen money from other investors? How could he smile and make small talk when he was planning to flee the country and leave hundreds of families without income? But his casual confidence also told me something important. Michael truly believed he was untouchable. He thought his plan was perfect, his cover-up was complete, and his escape route was secure. The possibility that a terminated employee could threaten his scheme had never seriously crossed his mind. That overconfidence was going to be his downfall. At 2 o'clock, people began filing into the main auditorium for the afternoon keynote session. I positioned myself in the middle section, about 20 rows back from the stage, where I would have a clear view of both Michael and the audience reaction. Patricia was sitting in the VIP section reserved for major sponsors and board members. Lisa had managed to get a seat in the front row, ostensibly to support her boss, but actually to document his reaction when everything fell apart. The conference moderator, a well-known Austin tech blogger named Jessica Parker, took the stage to introduce the keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who has become a symbol of resilience and innovative thinking in our community. 6 months ago, Pinnacle Dynamics was facing bankruptcy and the loss of hundreds of jobs. Today, thanks to visionary leadership and strategic decision-making, the company has secured the largest funding round in Austin history and is positioned for explosive growth. Please welcome CEO Michael Thompson to share his insights on crisis leadership and strategic recovery. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Michael walked onto the stage, waving and smiling like a politician at a campaign rally. He looked perfectly comfortable under the bright lights, adjusting his wireless microphone with the ease of someone who had given hundreds of presentations. "Thank you for that warm welcome," he began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the massive auditorium. "When I look out at this audience, I see the future of American innovation. I see entrepreneurs who understand that crisis creates opportunity. I see leaders who know that the greatest successes often emerge from the most challenging circumstances." He clicked his wireless presenter remote, expecting to see his first slide appear on the giant screen behind him. Instead, the screen displayed a bank statement showing the transfer of $647 million from Pinnacle Dynamics to Meridian Holdings, with the transaction date and account numbers clearly visible. Michael didn't notice immediately because he was facing the audience, but the auditorium fell silent as 3,000 people stared at the financial document projected behind him. I could see confusion rippling through the crowd as people tried to understand what they were looking at. "The key to crisis leadership," Michael continued, oblivious to what was happening behind him, "is maintaining focus on long-term value creation while managing short-term operational challenges." He clicked to advance to his next slide, and the screen changed to show an email exchange between Michael and Robert Kellner, discussing the timeline for moving stolen funds through shell companies. The subject line read, "Phase 2 Implementation. Urgent," and included specific instructions about avoiding federal reporting requirements. That's when Michael finally noticed that something was wrong. The audience wasn't looking at him anymore. They were staring at the screen behind him with expressions of shock and growing understanding. He turned around to see what had captured their attention, and I watched his face change from confusion to horror to panic in the span of about 3 seconds. "This appears to be some kind of technical malfunction," he said, his voice noticeably shaky now. "Let me just—" He clicked his remote again, probably hoping to regain control of the presentation, but the next image was even more damaging. A recorded phone conversation transcript between Michael and an attorney in the Cayman Islands, discussing the establishment of offshore accounts and the procedures for accessing funds without triggering U.S. banking regulations. The auditorium was completely silent now except for the sound of people shifting in their seats and the occasional whispered conversation. Camera phones were appearing throughout the audience as people began documenting what they were seeing. Several journalists in the press section were frantically typing on laptops and making phone calls. Michael tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was clearly visible on his forehead under the stage lights. "I'm not sure what kind of technical error we're experiencing here, but I can assure you that these documents are—" The screen changed again, this time showing a calendar entry from Michael's schedule. "Meeting with R. The board of directors held an emergency meeting an hour ago. They want to offer you Michael's job. Chief Executive Officer. The position I had been working toward my entire career, offered to me not despite the fact that I had exposed corporate fraud, but because of it. The board had realized that they needed someone with integrity and competence to rebuild the company's reputation and properly manage the funding I had secured. There's something else," Jake continued. "They're also planning to offer positions to everyone who was terminated along with you. The board realizes that Michael probably fired people to prevent them from discovering his crimes." As I walked out of the convention center into the bright Texas sunshine, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been a senior analyst working 18-hour days to save a company I believed in. 3 weeks ago, I had been a terminated employee with no job, no prospects, and no power to fight back against the injustice I had suffered. Now I was about to become the CEO of a company with $800 million in funding, and the opportunity to build something truly special in the Austin tech community. But more importantly, I had proven something that my parents had always taught me, but that I had sometimes doubted in the face of powerful people who seemed untouchable. Hard work, integrity, and determination really could triumph over corruption and greed. Truth really could defeat lies when brave people were willing to take risks to expose it. Michael Thompson had fired me by text message thinking he was eliminating a threat to his criminal plans. Instead, he had created the very enemy who would bring him down. The little girl from East Austin whose parents worked double shifts at the packing plant was about to become the CEO of one of the most well-funded tech companies in Texas history. And this was just the beginning. The drive back to Pinnacle Dynamics felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream where everything familiar had been transformed into something completely different. The same Austin streets, the same downtown skyline, but I was no longer Emma Rodriguez, the terminated employee. I was Emma Rodriguez, the woman who had just exposed one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in Texas history, and apparently the next CEO of a company with $800 million in funding. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since I left the convention center. CNN wanted a live interview. The Wall Street Journal was sending a reporter to Austin. Forbes was already working on a cover story about corporate whistleblowing and crisis leadership. The Austin Business Journal wanted to do an exclusive feature on how a local financial analyst had taken down a corrupt CEO and saved hundreds of jobs. But before I could think about media interviews or magazine covers, I had a company to rebuild and people to face. The Pinnacle Dynamics headquarters looked exactly the same from the outside, but I knew that inside, everything had changed. Michael Thompson's office would be empty. His executive team would be scrambling to distance themselves from his crimes, and 400 employees would be wondering what came next for their careers and their families. The security guard at the front desk, Frank, looked up with surprise when I walked through the main entrance. "Emma, I heard what happened at the conference. Is it true? Did Michael really steal all that money?" Word traveled fast in the Austin tech community, especially when it involved a CEO being arrested on live television in front of 3,000 witnesses. "It's true, Frank. But the good news is that the money is being recovered, and everyone's jobs are safe." The relief on his face was immediate and profound. "Thank God. My wife and I have been so worried ever since you got fired." We knew something wasn't right about the whole situation. As I walked through the lobby toward the elevators, I noticed other employees recognizing me and whispering to each other. Some looked curious, others grateful. A few seemed confused about why I was back in the building. By the time I reached the executive floor, there was a small crowd following me. People who had heard fragments of news about Michael's arrest and wanted to understand what was really happening. The boardroom door was open, and I could see several board members huddled around a conference table covered with legal documents, laptops, and cell phones. Patricia Williams was there, along with 3 other directors I recognized from previous presentations. They looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and the relief on their faces was unmistakable. "Emma," said board chairman Robert Chen, standing up immediately. "Thank God you're here. We need to talk." The next 2 hours were unlike anything I had ever experienced in corporate America. Instead of being questioned or blamed or treated with suspicion, I was being asked to take charge of fixing the disaster that Michael Thompson had created. The board had spent the afternoon in emergency session, consulting with attorneys, investigators, and financial experts to understand the full scope of the damage and determine how to move forward. The FBI and SEC have confirmed that they've frozen approximately $750 million in shell company accounts, Patricia explained, sliding a folder of documents across the table to me. Preliminary analysis suggests that nearly all of the stolen funds will be recoverable, though it may take several months to complete the legal process. Robert Chen leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but hopeful. "Emma, we know this is an unusual situation, but we'd like to offer you the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. You understand this company's finances better than anyone. You have the trust of the employees. Most importantly, you've proven that you have the integrity and courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." Chief Executive Officer. The words hung in the air like something from a fantasy. 6 months ago, I had been a senior analyst hoping for a promotion to assistant director. 3 weeks ago, I had been a terminated employee wondering how I would pay my student loans. Now, I was being offered the top job at a company that was about to become one of the most well-funded tech firms in the country. "What about the current executive team?" I asked. "What about the employees who might have been involved in covering up Michael's crimes?" Patricia pulled out another folder. "We've conducted preliminary interviews with all senior staff. Sarah Murphy in HR and Tom Wilson in legal have been terminated for their roles in facilitating the fraud. Several other executives have been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. But the vast majority of employees had no knowledge of Michael's crimes and will be retained." She paused, then smiled for the first time all day. Kellner discussed timeline for Cayman transfer and departure logistics. The date was next week. Jessica Parker, the conference moderator, appeared at the side of the stage looking confused and concerned. She was clearly receiving instructions through her earpiece from the event organizers, who were probably scrambling to figure out what was happening and how to handle it. But before she could intervene, the presentation continued. The next slide was a comprehensive diagram showing the network of shell companies Michael had created, with arrows indicating the flow of money from Pinnacle Dynamics through multiple intermediary accounts before ending up in offshore banks. It looked like something from a law enforcement briefing about organized crime. That's when the real chaos began. A voice from the audience shouted, "Is this some kind of joke?" Another person called out, "Those are real bank account numbers." Someone else yelled, "He's stealing investor money." Michael abandoned any pretense of maintaining control. He yanked off his wireless microphone and started walking quickly toward the side exit, but Jessica Parker stepped into his path. "Mr. Thompson, I think we need some clarification about what we're seeing here. These appear to be serious allegations of financial misconduct." "This is obviously some kind of hoax or cyber attack," Michael said, his voice rising with desperation. I have no idea how these fabricated documents got into our presentation system, but I can assure you that Pinnacle Dynamics operates with complete integrity and transparency." The screen behind him changed one more time, displaying the most damning evidence we had compiled. It was a video recording, apparently taken with a hidden camera during one of Michael's meetings with Robert Kellner. The audio quality was excellent, and Michael's voice was clearly audible as he discussed the timeline for completing the theft and his plans to leave the country permanently. "The beauty of this structure," Michael was saying in the recording, "is that by the time anyone realizes what happened, we'll be long gone, and the money will be completely untraceable. These investors will be lucky to recover 10 cents on the dollar." The audience erupted. People were standing up, pointing at the stage, shouting questions and accusations. The noise level was incredible, like being inside a sports stadium during a controversial call. Camera phones were everywhere, capturing both the evidence on the screen and Michael's reaction to being exposed. That's when I saw the federal agents moving through the auditorium. They weren't obvious about it, but I had been briefed on what to look for. Men and women in business attire moving purposefully through the crowd, showing badges to security personnel, positioning themselves at exits. Patricia had coordinated with the FBI and SEC to have agents present in case Michael tried to flee when confronted with the evidence. Michael saw them too. His head swiveled as he spotted agents at multiple exits, and the reality of his situation finally hit him. This wasn't just a public relations disaster or a technical malfunction. This was a coordinated law enforcement operation, and he was the target. He made a run for it. Michael bolted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the stage, but 2 agents were already positioned there. When he saw them, he changed direction and jumped down into the audience, trying to push through the crowd toward one of the main exits. The auditorium was in complete chaos now. 3,000 people were on their feet, some trying to get a better view of the action, others trying to get out of the way as Michael and the federal agents moved through the crowd. The massive screens were still displaying evidence of the financial fraud, providing a surreal backdrop to the live-action chase happening in front of them. I stood up on my chair to get a better view and saw Michael about halfway down the main aisle, pushing past startled conference attendees while agents converged on his position from multiple directions. The desperation on his face was unmistakable. This was a man who had just seen his entire world collapse in the span of 10 minutes. When the agents finally reached him, Michael's arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic. He didn't resist or try to fight. He just stopped, raised his hands slightly, and allowed himself to be handcuffed while hundreds of people recorded the moment on their phones. Agent Sarah Mitchell, the lead FBI investigator Patricia had been working with, read Michael his rights, in a clear voice that carried throughout the now silent auditorium. Michael Thompson, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents escorted Michael out of the auditorium, the audience slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. The largest tech conference in Texas had become the venue for exposing one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in the state's history. Jessica Parker, who had been standing frozen on the stage during the chaos, finally found her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we're obviously going to need to suspend today's programming while law enforcement conducts their investigation. Thank you for your patience and understanding during this unprecedented situation. But nobody was leaving. The auditorium was buzzing with conversation as people shared what they had seen, compared photos and videos, and tried to understand the full scope of what had been revealed. Journalists were conducting impromptu interviews with anyone who claimed to know Michael or have business dealings with Pinnacle Dynamics. I made my way through the crowd toward the exit, feeling a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and satisfaction that I had never experienced before. We had actually done it. We had exposed Michael Thompson's crimes in the most public and undeniable way possible. There would be no covering this up, no explaining it away, no dismissing it as the complaints of a disgruntled employee. As I reached the lobby, Patricia appeared at my side, grinning like someone who had just won the lottery. Emma, that was absolutely perfect. The agents arrested Robert Kellner and 2 other accomplices simultaneously at locations across the city. The SEC has frozen all the shell company accounts, and preliminary estimates suggest they'll be able to recover most of the stolen funds. The magnitude of what we had accomplished was starting to sink in. Not only had we stopped Michael from stealing $800 million, but we had done it in a way that would serve as a warning to every other executive who might be tempted to commit similar crimes. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and text messages, news outlets wanting interviews, former colleagues expressing shock and support, business leaders who had seen the presentation asking if I was available for consulting opportunities. But the call that mattered most came from Jake Martinez. Emma, you need to get back to Pinnacle as soon as possible. In fact, we'd like you to consider bringing back everyone who was terminated along with you. Our internal review suggests that Michael fired people not for performance reasons, but because he was afraid they might discover evidence of his theft. The magnitude of what they were offering began to sink in. Not only would I become CEO, but I would have the opportunity to right the wrongs that Michael had committed against my former colleagues. Jake Martinez, who had risked his job to help me discover the truth, would be promoted to Chief Technology Officer. Lisa Chen, who had gathered crucial evidence despite the personal risk, would become my new executive assistant with a significant salary increase. There's one more thing, Robert Chen said, consulting his notes. The board has voted to implement a new compensation structure that includes equity participation for all employees. When this company goes public, which we expect to happen within the next 2 years, everyone who helped build it will share in the success. I thought about my parents, who had worked their entire lives without ever having the opportunity to build real wealth or security. I thought about my sister, whose quinceañera had been interrupted by the text message that started this whole ordeal. I thought about every woman who had ever been told she wasn't executive material, every immigrant family that had sacrificed for their children's education, every person who had been dismissed or underestimated by people like Michael Thompson. "I accept," I said simply. The boardroom erupted in applause, but all I could think about was the work ahead. Rebuilding trust with investors, implementing new oversight procedures, developing the products and services that would justify the massive funding round, and most importantly, creating a company culture where fraud and corruption could never take root again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of 14-hour days, media interviews, legal depositions, and strategic planning sessions. The story of Michael Thompson's fraud and my role in exposing it had captured national attention, turning me into an unlikely poster child for corporate accountability and whistleblower protection. But the real satisfaction came from the smaller, more personal moments. The day Jake Martinez moved into his new office as Chief Technology Officer, grinning like someone who had just won the lottery. The morning Lisa Chen brought me coffee in my new corner office and mentioned that she had been able to put a down payment on a house with her new salary. The afternoon when all 12 of the employees who had been terminated with me returned to work, this time with promotions, raises, and equity stakes in the company. 3 months after Michael's arrest, I was sitting in that same corner office, looking out at the Austin skyline, when Patricia Williams knocked on my door with news about the criminal case. "Michael Thompson pled guilty to all charges this morning," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. 47 years in federal prison. Robert Kellner and his associates received similar sentences. The judge called it one of the most egregious cases of securities fraud she had ever seen. 47 years. Michael would be an old man before he ever had the chance to walk free again. More importantly, his guilty plea meant that all of the stolen funds would be returned to Pinnacle within 60 days, giving us the resources we needed to execute the growth strategy I had been developing. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "The SEC has decided to use our case as a model for new regulations requiring real-time disclosure of executive financial transactions. They're calling it the Rodriguez Rule." The Rodriguez Rule, legislation designed to prevent future corporate fraud, named after the woman from East Austin who had refused to let a corrupt CEO destroy the company she had helped save. It was more recognition than I had ever imagined possible, but also a reminder of the responsibility that came with the position I now held. 6 months later, I stood on the same stage at the Austin Convention Center where Michael Thompson had been arrested, but this time the circumstances were completely different. I was delivering the keynote address at the Texas Innovation Summit, discussing the lessons learned from corporate fraud and the importance of building ethical business cultures. The auditorium was packed with many of the same people who had witnessed Michael's downfall, but their expressions were focused and engaged rather than shocked and confused. I had spent months preparing this presentation, not because I needed to impress potential investors, but because I wanted to share what I had learned about leadership, integrity, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. "Corporate fraud doesn't happen in a vacuum," I told the audience. "It happens when good people stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. It happens when employees are afraid to report suspicious behavior. It happens when boards of directors prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. But it can be prevented when we create cultures where truth-telling is valued over loyalty to individual leaders." I clicked to advance my presentation, and the screen behind me displayed a chart showing Pinnacle's progress since the fraud had been exposed. Revenue growth, employee satisfaction scores, client retention rates, and innovation metrics all trending upward at rates that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Pinnacle Dynamics has grown by 230% in the 18 months since we implemented new governance and transparency standards. We've hired over 600 new employees, all of whom participate in our equity sharing program. We've launched 4 new products that are revolutionizing manufacturing automation. And we've done all of this while maintaining the highest ethical standards in the industry. But the statistics, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real transformation that had occurred at Pinnacle. We had created something that went beyond financial success or market leadership. We had built a company where people felt valued, where innovation flourished, where everyone understood that they had a stake in our collective success. The standing ovation that followed my presentation was gratifying, but what mattered more were the conversations afterward. Young entrepreneurs asking about building ethical business cultures, employees from other companies sharing their own stories of workplace fraud and asking for advice about how to report it, investors expressing interest in funding companies that prioritize transparency and accountability. As I left the convention center that evening, I walked past the spot where Michael Thompson had been arrested 2 years earlier. The Austin skyline glittered in the distance, including the Pinnacle Dynamics headquarters where hundreds of employees were working on projects that would shape the future of American manufacturing. My phone buzzed with a text message, but this time it was from my sister, not from a boss planning to fire me. Saw your speech on the live stream. Abuela says she's proud of the girl who learned to make tamales and then took down the bad CEO. We're all proud of you, Emma. I smiled, thinking about how far I had traveled from that quinceañera where everything started. The girl who had been fired by text message for supposedly failing to meet performance standards was now running a billion-dollar company and speaking at industry conferences about leadership and ethics. But the most important transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. I had learned that standing up for what's right isn't just about exposing wrongdoing or achieving justice, though both of those things matter enormously. It's about proving to yourself and others that integrity isn't a luxury you can afford only when it's convenient. It's a fundamental choice about who you want to be and what kind of world you want to live in. Michael Thompson had thought he could steal $800 million and destroy 400 lives without consequences. He had thought that firing me would eliminate the threat I posed to his criminal plans. He had thought that power and connections would protect him from accountability. He was wrong about all of it. 2 years later, Michael was serving a 47-year prison sentence while I was running the company he had tried to destroy. The money he had stolen was funding innovation and job creation instead of offshore bank accounts. The employees he had planned to abandon were thriving as equity holders in one of Austin's most successful tech companies. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it's more complete and satisfying than you could have imagined. Sometimes the person who seems powerless turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room. And sometimes getting fired by text message is the best thing that ever happens to your career. As I drove home through the streets of Austin, past the neighborhoods where I had grown up and the university where I had earned my MBA, I thought about all the young women who might be facing their own Michael Thompsons right now, women who were being overlooked, underestimated, or mistreated by people who thought they could get away with it. I hoped my story would reach them and remind them that they have more power than they realize, that fighting back is possible, even when the odds seem impossible, that sometimes the person who fires you by text message ends up creating their own worst nightmare. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 31 years old, the CEO of Pinnacle Dynamics, and the woman who proved that integrity and determination can triumph over corruption and greed. This is my story, but more importantly, it's proof that your story can have a better ending than you think possible. 5 years have passed since that text message changed my life forever, and I'm sitting in the executive boardroom of Pinnacle Dynamics, preparing for what might be the most important presentation of my career. Tomorrow morning, we'll be ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange as Pinnacle Dynamics goes public in what analysts are calling the largest IPO in Texas history. The company that Michael Thompson tried to destroy through theft and fraud is now valued at $12 billion. The $800 million in funding that I secured and he attempted to steal has grown into a technology empire that employs over 15,000 people across 6 countries. Every single person who was fired along with me that day is now a millionaire through their equity stakes in the company. But numbers, impressive as they are, don't tell the real story of transformation. They don't capture the phone calls I get from young women facing their own workplace battles, asking for advice about how to fight back against corrupt bosses. They don't reflect the legislation that has been passed in 12 states requiring real-time financial disclosure from corporate executives. They don't measure the cultural shift that has occurred in Austin's tech community, where ethical business practices are now seen as competitive advantages rather than optional luxuries. This morning, I received a letter that reminded me why all of this matters more than stock prices or market valuations. It was from Maria Santos, a 24-year-old financial analyst at a startup in Dallas, who had discovered that her CEO was embezzling client funds. Instead of staying silent or looking for another job, she had followed the playbook that Patricia Williams and I had developed for exposing corporate fraud safely and effectively. "Dear Ms. Rodriguez," her letter began, "I wanted to thank you for showing me that fighting back was possible. Last month, I helped the FBI arrest my former boss for stealing $2 million from our clients. This week, the board of directors offered me his job. I'm writing this letter from my new office as the youngest female CEO in Dallas tech history. None of this would have happened if I hadn't seen your story and realized that ordinary people can defeat powerful criminals when they refuse to stay silent." Maria's story was one of dozens I had heard over the years. Accountants who had exposed tax fraud, engineers who had reported safety violations, sales managers who had documented bribery schemes, all of them citing my experience with Michael Thompson as inspiration for their own courage to speak truth to power. The ripple effects had spread far beyond individual cases of whistleblowing. Harvard Business School now teaches a case study based on the Pinnacle Dynamics fraud, focusing on how employees can recognize and report financial crimes. The SEC had implemented the Rodriguez Rule nationwide, requiring executives at public companies to disclose financial transactions in real time, rather than quarterly reports that could hide theft for months. More personally, my parents had been able to retire from their factory jobs and move into a beautiful house in the hills west of Austin. My sister had graduated from UT with a degree in business administration, inspired by watching her older sister transform from terminated employee to Fortune 500 CEO. My grandmother, who had taught me to make tamales during that fateful quinceañera weekend, lived long enough to see me featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of America's most influential young leaders. The irony of my success was that it had all stemmed from what initially seemed like the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Getting fired by text message had felt like professional death, but it had actually been professional rebirth. Being dismissed and underestimated had forced me to develop skills and strengths I never knew I possessed. I had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. During those terrifying weeks when I was gathering evidence against Michael Thompson, I was afraid every single day. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being ignored, afraid of making things worse for myself and others. But I had acted anyway because staying silent would have meant letting injustice triumph. The leadership lessons I had gained from that experience had transformed how I ran Pinnacle Dynamics. Instead of creating a culture where employees were afraid to report problems, we had built systems that rewarded transparency and truth-telling. Our annual employee satisfaction surveys consistently ranked among the highest in the industry, not because we avoided difficult conversations, but because we had created an environment where difficult conversations were safe and valued. We had implemented what we called radical transparency throughout the organization. Financial data that most companies kept secret was shared with all employees on a monthly basis. Executive compensation was publicly disclosed not just to shareholders, but to every person who worked for the company. Board meetings included rotating representation from different departments, ensuring that frontline perspectives informed strategic decisions. The results spoke for themselves. Pinnacle had become the most innovative company in our industry, launching breakthrough products at a pace that competitors couldn't match. Our employee retention rate was 96%, unheard of in the notoriously high turnover tech sector. Client satisfaction scores exceeded industry averages by margins that business schools used as examples of what was possible when corporate culture prioritized ethics alongside profits. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had been personal. The scared young woman who had received that text message 5 years ago had evolved into someone who understood her own power and wasn't afraid to use it responsibly. I had learned to trust my instincts, speak up when I saw wrongdoing, and stand firm in my convictions even when facing pressure from people who seemed more powerful or connected. That confidence had served me well as Pinnacle grew from a struggling startup into a multinational corporation. During hostile takeover attempts, I had refused offers that would have made me personally wealthy, but would have destroyed the company culture we had built. When competitors tried to poach our top talent with enormous salary offers, I had focused on creating an environment where people wanted to stay, rather than simply matching financial packages. The night before our IPO, I walked through the Pinnacle headquarters one final time as a private company CEO. The building that had once felt like a prison when I was a junior analyst now felt like a second home. Every floor told the story of our growth. The original engineering department where Jake Martinez had first discovered Michael's theft, the executive suite where I had been offered the CEO position, the new research wing where our teams were developing artificial intelligence systems that would revolutionize manufacturing automation. In the lobby, there was a plaque that the board had installed on the 5th anniversary of Michael Thompson's arrest. It read, "Dedicated to all employees who have the courage to speak truth to power. Integrity is not negotiable." Below that was a smaller inscription. "In memory of Michael Thompson's victims and in honor of those who refuse to let injustice triumph." I had initially opposed including Michael's name on the plaque, feeling that he didn't deserve any kind of memorial, even a negative one. But Patricia Williams had convinced me that acknowledging what he had done was important for preventing future fraud. "People need to remember that corporate criminals aren't abstract figures from news stories," she had argued. "They're real. People who make deliberate choices to harm others." Naming him reminds everyone that evil is specific and personal, not vague and institutional. Patricia had been right, as she usually was. The plaque had become a powerful symbol for employees and visitors, a reminder that the prosperity and success surrounding them had been built in direct opposition to someone who had tried to destroy it all. It was a testament to the principle that sometimes the best way to honor victims is by ensuring that their suffering leads to positive change. As I prepared to leave the building that evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Detective Sarah Williams with the Austin Police Department. I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I thought you'd want to know. Michael Thompson died in federal prison this afternoon. Natural causes, apparently. He had a heart attack in his cell." The news hit me with unexpected force. For 5 years, Michael Thompson had been a living symbol of corporate corruption, serving his 47-year sentence as proof that justice was possible even for powerful criminals. His death felt like the closing of a chapter that I wasn't sure I was ready to finish. "Thank you for letting me know, Detective. I appreciate the call." After hanging up, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time, trying to process my feelings about Michael's death. I didn't feel sorry for him. He had destroyed too many lives and caused too much suffering to deserve sympathy. But I didn't feel triumphant either. His death felt more like the end of a long illness than a victory for justice. What I felt most strongly was gratitude. Gratitude that I had been in a position to stop him before he could complete his theft and flee the country. Gratitude that the evidence we had gathered had prevented hundreds of families from losing their livelihoods. Gratitude that his crimes had been exposed in a way that led to systemic changes protecting other potential victims. The next morning, as I stood on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange waiting to ring the opening bell, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From a cubicle in Austin to the most famous trading floor in the world. From a terminated employee to the CEO of a company worth $12 billion. From someone who felt powerless to someone who had proven that individuals could change entire systems when they refused to accept injustice. The ceremonial bell ringing was scheduled for exactly 9:30 a.m. At 9:29, I received a text message that made me smile. It was from Jake Martinez, who was watching the live stream from our Austin headquarters along with thousands of Pinnacle employees. 5 years ago, you got fired by text. Today, you're ringing the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. Sometimes karma takes a while, but it always shows up. As the countdown reached 0 and I pressed the button that officially launched Pinnacle Dynamics as a public company, I thought about all the people who had made this moment possible. Lisa Chen, who had risked her job to gather evidence against Michael Thompson, Patricia Williams, who had provided the credibility and connections needed to expose his crimes, David Kim, who had validated our suspicions with his financial expertise, every employee who had trusted me to lead them through the transformation from crisis to triumph. But mostly, I thought about my parents, who had taught me that hard work and integrity were the only reliable paths to success. They had never owned stock in a public company, never attended a business conference, never seen the inside of a corporate boardroom, but they had given me the values that made everything else possible. The trading floor erupted in applause as Pinnacle's stock began trading at $87 per share, 20% above the initial offering price. Investors were betting that a company built on ethical principles could generate returns that exceeded those of competitors who prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Time would tell whether they were right, but I was confident in our ability to prove that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive. We had already demonstrated that transparency and accountability could coexist with innovation and growth. Now we had the opportunity to show that those principles could scale to a global corporation without being diluted or compromised. As I left the stock exchange and walked through the streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the lessons I had learned during 5 years of building a company from the ashes of corporate fraud. The most important insight was that leadership isn't about having power over other people. It's about using whatever power you have to create opportunities for others to succeed. Every decision I had made as CEO had been guided by a simple question. Would this choice make life better for our employees, our clients, and our community? Sometimes the answer required short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits. Sometimes it meant turning down profitable opportunities that would have compromised our values. But consistently applying that standard had created a culture where people felt valued and empowered, rather than exploited and manipulated. The flight back to Austin gave me time to think about what came next. Pinnacle Dynamics was now a public company with responsibilities to shareholders, regulators, and the broader financial community. The scrutiny would be intense, the pressure enormous, the margin for error smaller than ever before. But I was ready for those challenges because I had learned something invaluable during my battle with Michael Thompson. The most dangerous person in any room isn't necessarily the one with the most money or the highest title. It's the one with the most integrity and the least to lose by telling the truth. I had spent 5 years building a company where truth-telling was rewarded rather than punished, where employees felt safe reporting problems rather than hiding them, where success was measured not just by financial metrics, but by the positive impact we had on people's lives. As our plane descended toward Austin, I could see the Pinnacle Dynamics headquarters gleaming in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the cranes and construction equipment of a city that was growing rapidly around the technology industry we had helped create. 15,000 people were counting on me to lead them wisely and ethically into an uncertain but promising future. It was a responsibility I had never asked for but had learned to embrace. 5 years ago, Michael Thompson had fired me by text message thinking he was solving a problem. Instead, he had created his own replacement. Someone who understood that real leadership requires courage, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 34 years old, the CEO of a $12 billion company, and living proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that happens to you. The girl who got fired by text message had become the woman who rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. The employee who was dismissed for supposedly failing to meet performance standards had created performance standards that inspired an entire industry. And somewhere in federal prison, Michael Thompson's story had finally ended while mine was just beginning to reach its full potential. 10 years after Michael Thompson's arrest, I found myself standing in the same Austin Convention Center where it all began. But this time, I wasn't attending the Texas Innovation Summit as a speaker or participant. I was there as the keynote sponsor, and the entire event had been renamed the Emma Rodriguez Ethics in Leadership Summit. The transformation felt surreal, like looking at my life through a funhouse mirror that somehow made everything bigger and more meaningful than I had ever imagined possible. The convention center had been completely renovated since that day when Michael was dragged away in handcuffs. New glass facades, state-of-the-art audio-visual systems, and modern amenities that reflected Austin's evolution from a quirky college town to a major tech hub. But despite all the changes, I could still picture exactly where I had been sitting when those incriminating documents appeared on the giant screen behind Michael's unsuspecting figure. Today's summit was different from anything the tech industry had seen before. Instead of focusing solely on innovation and investment opportunities, the entire 3-day event was dedicated to exploring how business leaders could build ethical, sustainable companies that created value for all stakeholders rather than just shareholders. The agenda included sessions on whistleblower protection, corporate transparency, employee ownership models, and sustainable business practices. The opening ceremony began with a video tribute to the dozens of corporate whistleblowers whose courage had led to meaningful reforms over the past decade. Maria Santos, the young woman from Dallas whose letter had meant so much to me, was now featured prominently as someone who had built a multi-billion-dollar company based on radical transparency principles. Her company had become a model for how tech startups could prioritize ethical practices from day one, rather than trying to retrofit integrity into established cultures. As I watched the video, I was struck by how many of the featured whistleblowers were women, many of them young, women of color who had refused to stay silent when confronted with corporate misconduct. The pattern wasn't coincidental. Research had shown that women and minorities were more likely to report workplace fraud, partly because they were already outsiders to traditional power structures and had less to lose by challenging authority. But the cost of speaking up remained enormous for many of these women. Several had been blacklisted from their industries, forced to relocate their families, or subjected to legal harassment from the companies they had exposed. The summit included panel discussions about creating better support systems for whistleblowers, including legal defense funds, career transition assistance, and mental health resources for people dealing with the trauma of workplace retaliation. One speaker who particularly moved me was Dr. Rachel Kim, a former pharmaceutical researcher who had exposed her company's decision to hide dangerous side effects from a popular medication. Her revelations had prevented thousands of deaths and led to the largest healthcare fraud settlement in history, but the personal cost had been devastating. She had been fired, sued for violating confidentiality agreements, and subjected to a smear campaign that destroyed her reputation in the scientific community. People often ask me if I regret speaking up, Dr. Kim told the audience during her presentation. The honest answer is that there are days when I wonder what my life would have been like if I had stayed silent. I would probably still have my research career. My marriage might not have ended, and I wouldn't wake up some mornings feeling like I'm drowning in anxiety about money in the future. She paused, looking out at the audience of 3,000 business leaders, entrepreneurs, and activists who hung on every word. But then I think about the children who are alive today because their parents didn't take medication that would have killed them. I think about the families who didn't lose loved ones to preventable drug interactions. I think about the researchers who now have stronger protections when they need to report safety concerns. And I know that every sleepless night, every financial struggle, every moment of doubt was worth it. The standing ovation that followed her remarks lasted nearly 5 minutes. Dr. Kim's story represented something that had become central to my own understanding of leadership, that doing the right thing often requires personal sacrifice, but those sacrifices create ripple effects that make the world better for countless other people. During the lunch break, I was approached by a young man who looked barely old enough to have graduated college. He introduced himself as David Chen, a software engineer at a major social media company who had discovered that his employer was deliberately amplifying conspiracy theories and hate speech because controversial content generated more user engagement and advertising revenue. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been trying to figure out how to report this for months, but I'm terrified of losing my job. I have student loans, my parents depend on me financially, and I'm on a work visa that could be revoked if I get fired. But I also know that our algorithms are literally spreading information that's getting people killed. David's dilemma was heartbreakingly familiar. He was facing the same impossible choice that I had confronted 10 years earlier. Stay silent and complicit in harmful behavior, or speak up and risk destroying your own life in the process. The difference was that David had reached out for guidance instead of facing the decision alone. David, let me introduce you to some people who can help, I said, thinking immediately of the network of attorneys, investigators, and advocacy organizations that had grown up around the whistleblower protection movement. You don't have to choose between doing the right thing and protecting yourself. There are ways to expose wrongdoing safely, and there are people who specialize in helping employees navigate these situations. Over the next hour, I connected David with Patricia Williams, who had left corporate governance consulting to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting corporate whistleblowers. Patricia's organization provided legal advice, financial assistance, and career transition support for employees who discovered workplace misconduct. They had successfully protected dozens of whistleblowers and helped expose billions of dollars in corporate fraud without destroying the lives of the people who came forward. Watching Patricia work with David reminded me of how much the landscape had changed since my confrontation with Michael Thompson. Back then, I had felt completely alone, unsure of where to turn for help or guidance. Now there was an entire ecosystem of support for people facing similar situations. Law firms that specialized in whistleblower protection, advocacy groups that provided financial assistance, career counselors who helped people transition to new industries when necessary. The summit also featured a remarkable presentation by Jake Martinez, who had evolved from Pinnacle's chief technology officer into one of the country's leading experts on financial technology and fraud prevention. Jake's team had developed artificial intelligence systems that could detect suspicious financial transactions in real time, making it much harder for executives to steal money without being caught immediately. The technology that enabled Michael Thompson's theft simply wouldn't work today, Jake explained to a fascinated audience. Modern banking systems have AI monitors that flag unusual transaction patterns within minutes rather than months. Corporate financial software includes automatic alerts when money moves between accounts without proper authorization. Blockchain technology creates permanent, tamper-proof records of every financial transaction. But Jake also emphasized that technology alone couldn't prevent corporate fraud. The most sophisticated monitoring system in the world is useless if employees are afraid to report what they see. Culture matters more than code. Trust matters more than technology. People have to feel safe speaking up when they notice something wrong. That evening's dinner featured a surprise that caught me completely off guard. Lisa Chen, my former ally who had provided crucial evidence against Michael Thompson, took the stage to announce the creation of the Emma Rodriguez Foundation for Corporate Ethics. The foundation would provide financial support for whistleblowers, fund research into corporate accountability, and advocate for stronger legal protections for employees who report workplace misconduct. 10 years ago, Emma Rodriguez proved that one person with courage and integrity could defeat a corrupt system, Lisa told the dinner audience. Tonight, we're announcing a $10 million commitment to ensure that future whistleblowers have the resources and support they need to follow her example. The foundation's initial funding came from an unexpected source: the forfeited assets from Michael Thompson's criminal case. The FBI had seized his houses, cars, jewelry, and other luxury items purchased with stolen money. Instead of selling those assets at auction, federal prosecutors had worked with our legal team to donate their value to organizations working on corporate ethics and whistleblower protection. It seems appropriate that Michael Thompson's ill-gotten gains should be used to prevent future corporate fraud, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh explained during her remarks. The money he stole to fund his lifestyle will now fund the fight against corporate crime. That feels like justice to me. The symbolism was powerful, but what moved me more was the practical impact the foundation would have on people like David Chen and Dr. Rachel Kim. Future whistleblowers would have access to legal representation, financial assistance during employment, transitions, and emotional support during what was inevitably a traumatic process. They wouldn't have to choose between doing the right thing and protecting their family's financial security. During the final day of the summit, I participated in a panel discussion with 5 other women who had exposed major corporate scandals over the past decade. The diversity of industries and types of fraud was striking: healthcare, finance, technology, energy, and manufacturing. But the patterns were remarkably similar across all our experiences. We had all been relatively junior employees when we discovered the misconduct. We had all initially tried to report problems through internal channels before going to external authorities. We had all faced retaliation, harassment, and attempts to discredit our credibility. And we had all ultimately succeeded in stopping harmful behavior that would have affected thousands or millions of people. What I want young women in the audience to understand, said Sarah Williams, who had exposed massive environmental violations at an oil company, is that you don't need permission to do the right thing. You don't need to wait until you're senior enough or powerful enough or connected enough. When you see something wrong, you already have everything you need to stop it: your conscience, your courage, and your voice. The panel discussion was being live-streamed to universities across the country, and the chat comments showed hundreds of students asking questions about how to prepare for ethical leadership challenges they might face in their careers. Business. Schools were beginning to incorporate ethics training into their core curricula, but many students felt unprepared for the reality of workplace misconduct. The most important thing you can do right now, I told the online audience, is to start practicing ethical decision-making in small situations so you'll be ready when big ones arise. Stand up for classmates who are being treated unfairly. Report cheating when you see it. Choose honesty over convenience in your personal relationships. Integrity is like a muscle that gets stronger with exercise. One of the most powerful moments of the entire summit came during the closing ceremony, when a video message was played from inmates at federal prisons across the country. These were executives who had been convicted of corporate fraud and were serving time for their crimes. Their message was simple but profound. The momentary gains from corruption were never worth the permanent consequences. I thought I was too smart to get caught, said former Enron executive Jeffrey Skilling in a recorded interview. "I thought the rules didn't apply to me because I was successful and connected. I was wrong about everything. The money I stole is gone, but the damage to my family and my reputation will last forever." The video included similar testimonials from dozens of other white-collar criminals, all of them expressing regret and warning current business leaders about the true cost of unethical behavior. It was a sobering reminder that corporate crime destroys the perpetrators as thoroughly as it harms their victims. As the summit concluded and attendees began heading home to cities across the country and around the world, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for how far we had all come since that night when I received Michael Thompson's text message. The scared young analyst who had been fired for supposedly failing to meet performance standards had somehow become the inspiration for a global movement toward more ethical business practices. But the work was far from finished. Corporate fraud remained a massive problem, with billions of dollars stolen from investors, employees, and consumers every year. Environmental crimes continued to poison communities and accelerate climate change. Financial misconduct still devastated families and destabilized entire economies. The difference was that now there were systems and resources in place to fight back more effectively. Whistleblowers had legal protections, financial support, and professional networks that didn't exist when I was gathering evidence against Michael Thompson. Technology made it harder for criminals to hide their activities. Prosecutors had better tools for investigating complex financial crimes. Most importantly, there was a growing recognition throughout the business community that ethical behavior wasn't just morally right, it was also economically smart. Companies with strong ethical cultures consistently outperformed competitors on measures of innovation, employee retention, customer loyalty, and long-term profitability. Pinnacle Dynamics had become the poster child for this trend. Our commitment to transparency and accountability had attracted the best talent in the industry, created fierce customer loyalty, and generated returns that exceeded Wall Street expectations year after year. We had proven that you could do well by doing good, and dozens of other companies were following our model. As I flew back to Austin that evening, I thought about the young people who had attended the summit and would soon be entering the workforce. They would face ethical challenges that my generation couldn't have imagined. Artificial intelligence bias, climate change, global supply chain labor practices, data privacy, and social media manipulation. But they would also have tools and resources that we never had. They would work for companies with stronger ethical policies, better reporting mechanisms, and more robust oversight. They would have access to advocacy organizations, legal support, networks, and career transition assistance if they needed to blow the whistle on misconduct. Most importantly, they would have examples to follow. They would know that ordinary employees could defeat powerful criminals when they refused to stay silent. They would understand that integrity wasn't just a nice ideal, but a practical strategy for building successful careers and meaningful lives. The plane touched down in Austin just as the sun was setting over the hills west of the city. From my window seat, I could see the Pinnacle Dynamics headquarters building, its windows glowing in the golden light. 15,000 people worked in that building and dozens of others around the world, all of them part of a company that had been built on the foundation of Michael Thompson's attempted theft. My phone buzzed with a text message as I gathered my belongings. For just a moment, my heart skipped a beat, remembering another text message on another evening 10 years earlier. But this message was from my sister, who was now a successful entrepreneur running her own sustainable fashion company based on the ethical business principles I had helped popularize. Saw the live stream from the summit today. Mom and Dad watched too. They're so proud of what you've built, not just the company, but the movement. Abuela would have loved seeing her granddaughter inspire people all over the world to do the right thing. As I walked through the Austin airport toward the exit, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that terrifying text message to this moment of profound satisfaction and purpose. Michael Thompson had thought he was solving a problem when he fired me. Instead, he had created something he never could have imagined: A woman who would dedicate her life to ensuring that no one else would ever face what he had put me through. The scared young analyst was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real power came not from controlling others, but from empowering them to reach their full potential. The company that Michael had tried to destroy through theft had become a force for positive change that touched millions of lives around the world. And somewhere in a federal prison cemetery, Michael Thompson's story had ended while the movement he had inadvertently created was just getting started. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last decade proving that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you can do for the world. The text message that was meant to destroy my career had become the catalyst for transforming an entire industry. The attempt to silence me had given me a voice that now reached millions of people. The effort to make me powerless had taught me how to use power responsibly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.